Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes. Welcome, everyone. I'm Dan McPhee, Executive Director of the Urban Design Forum, and it's good to be back in community with our fellows this afternoon. For those of you that may be new to the forum, we're an independent membership organization debating the critical issues facing our city. Our fellows are designers, developers, public officials, and advocates working to shape a better future for all New Yorkers. We're really honored to be joined today by Mabel Wilson and Sean Anderson, who have mounted an incredibly energizing show at the Museum of Modern Art. If you haven't yet seen it, Reconstructions boldly imagines Black futures in 10 cities across the United States. Each of their new commissions grapples with a specific geography, like Kinloch, one of the free towns of Missouri, where Amanda Williams has woven together inventions pioneered by Black creators, or the core of Oakland, where Walter Hood has imagined skyscrapers designed and aligned with the Black Panthers 10-point program. If you haven't yet seen it, I urge you to see it before Monday when it closes to the public. And if you're not currently in New York, they've put together a wonderful companion fields guide, a series of recorded talks, and an online course exploring how race shapes architecture in the built environment. So please do take advantage of everything that they put together. Mabel and Sean have generously joined us to talk a little bit about their motivations in setting these works in the city, but I hope that we can also talk a little bit about some of the challenges of creating a future forward show in a fraught present. So how were Sean and Mabel able to drive this kind of imagination in our service-oriented disciplines and our often fumbling institutions? And what do they hope that the show makes possible once it comes down? What kind of imagination are future practitioners entitled to? And so we're really happy to have a number of our current Forefront Fellows, Jhordan Channer, Sheila Lin, and Addison Vawters, as well as a few of our alumni, Alp Bozkurt, April de Simone, and Emma Silverblatt. We're going to get started with the conversation between Sean and Mabel, and then one by one, I'm going to welcome our fellows on screen to reflect and pose a question of the curators and one another. We welcome you to share questions through the Q&A box, and we may even unmute you toward the end of the program so you can ask your question live. But before I hand things off to Mabel and Sean, I just want to briefly thank our board of directors, our director circle, and our fellows for their generous support for our programs and publications. Thank you all for hanging on with us in a distant year, and we're looking forward to seeing you all soon. And now I'm going to welcome Sean and Mabel on screen. Welcome, Sean and Mabel.
Good afternoon. Thanks, Dan, for the very generous introduction, and thanks all of you for joining us today at lunchtime. Those of you in the city might have had to deal with the subway this morning. Can only begin to understand that I just got here in Midtown after 2.25 hours of travel. But that's all to say that Mabel and I are both very excited to share with you some thinking that led to our exhibition And I think to your point, Dan, to think about what next and how do we imagine what happens next. Hi, Mabel.
Hi, Sean, and hello, everyone. Thanks for coming this afternoon. And why don't we get started since we don't have much time?
Absolutely. So I'm going to share the screen and there we are. So our talk today, very briefly, is going to begin with a moment in the 19th century, basically the mid to late 19th century, when the emergence and definition of what were called all Black towns, but also freedom colonies, among others, became spaces through and by which freed slaves, freed men and women and children could actually pass into and out of and create new spaces for themselves in the midst of the horrific conditions that were still ongoing in much of the southern United States. And this was due in part because the middle part of the United States at the time was still not, they weren't states. And by virtue of not being states, some of these places, like Oklahoma, for instance, and Kansas, basically new ways in which to live and to imagine living could happen. And so we start today with this image of Nicodemus, Kansas, and I will share, or we will share a few other examples just to give you a sense of not only the context with which we began, Mabel and I began our research for this exhibition, but the spaces of possibility and imagination that our work with the 11 participants of the exhibition began as well. But I think it's important that we begin also with the sense of movement, of transit, of passage through landscapes and geographies that were in part not necessarily accepting of or even allowed to create places of congregation for African American and for freed slaves or slaves in general. And to give you a sense, this is just a detail of a 1920s map of the northeastern United States of the pathways and routes that many of these individuals took along the Underground Railroad. And more recently, the artist Dawood Bey, a photographer, has, in this series from 2017, has located a lot of these contexts in which architecture and the landscape kind of more broadly become not only spaces of transit, but become spaces through which an understanding and a reckoning of racial and economic value begins to be translated more precisely. And so this is just one of a series in which Bey is looking at houses that were used as part of the Underground Railroad, but also that the white picket fence becomes a kind of marker of boundaries that are not only transgressed, but built in part to prevent or accept individuals. And so we thought it would be interesting also for this audience to give you a sense that freed men and women and children were very knowledgeable, in fact, of these freed spaces in the center of the United States, in particular of Oklahoma and Kansas. And advertisements were happening quite frequently by the late part of the 19th century, including this one. And the notion of immigration, I think, is quite fascinating to think of immigrating from one part of the United States where you are property, where your value is as labor, to move to a space and to a landscape that could potentially wholly be your own. So this is an extract from a letter written to the governor of Kansas in 1879 from a slave in Louisiana. And these spaces, these homesteads, if you will, became places in which families traveled, quite often in the same or along the same routes that, that Native Americans were being forced to travel along, to these spaces upon which then land was in part given to these individuals. Oftentimes they were leased. And so in Oklahoma in particular, where this extraordinary portrait is from, and then also Redbird, Oklahoma, which was one of the 13 major all-Black towns of Oklahoma, became spaces through which new towns could develop. And these individuals, these African-American individuals, were often named exodusters. The exodusters were the individuals who left the South or who left conflict settings in the South and where they were property, and set up new communities and new places of living for themselves in Kansas, in the center of the United States, but onward as well. And just to give you a sense, then I have two slides here of Boley, Oklahoma, which was the largest of the all-Black towns at the end of the 19th century. Boley, Oklahoma at one point had over 100,000 individuals living in it and families. And it was the largest city in size, but also the largest in terms of the infrastructure, the business, the commercial settings, and so forth. In fact, the individuals that you see in the top right of the screen were the founding principal town council for Boley. And what's unique too about Boley is that these individuals of the town council then leased the land upon which Boley was forged from a Native American woman who had inherited this land through her father, who had passed away. And so you get a sense here, this is a late 19th century image of Main Street on the right, and then a little bit later of the main bank in town on your left. And then another scene from 1920s in Boley, here a postcard, and then a 2019 view of Main Street as well. Boley today is primarily known for a very large rodeo in town that people from all over Oklahoma and the region visit.
So the exhibition Reconstructions asks, what does an architecture of redress and recovery look like in sites of racial disjunction? And clearly the all-Black towns really showed us the promise of the ways in which Black communities formed, built homes, businesses. You know, on Friday is the 100th anniversary of the destruction of Tulsa, Oklahoma, the neighborhood of Greenwood, right? And it shows the degree to which that promise of liberation and emancipation, and also what America meant as a project, really struck a chord with those who had been enslaved. And yet, the project of white supremacy and domination continued, not just in the 19th, but also into the 20th century, as we know, yesterday with the anniversary of George Floyd, into the 21st century. And so things like the HOLC maps, as we can see here in Brooklyn, which clearly parceled up parts of the city, gave metrics of evaluation, measure, right, to often neighborhoods that had Black residents consigned to substandard housing because of segregation, is a problem that has a legacy to today, and that the Museum of Modern Art does have a history of responding to it, but also often through a kind of body of knowledge and practitioners that don't necessarily address, I think, the broader spectrum of these complex histories. Next, please. And we know that in those segregated landscapes, right, and this is Mobile, Alabama, again, there is a way in which Black life thrived, that there were social spaces. So lateral to those spaces of disinvestment and deprivation were spaces of Black social life, kitchens and porches and street corners and gardens and clubs and places of worship that often are unseen by designers and architects, and yet are resonant within things like literature and poetry. And here Gordon Parks shows us a woman and child dressed immaculately. So the sense of self-fashioning in the face of segregation, as we can see here at the color entrance of a department store. Next, please.
And so these divisions, these separations, and these definitions, if you will, of where and how Black communities could live extends through the 20th century, as Mabel said, and also then began to be redefined through elements of violence as through law and so forth. And laws such as eminent domain began to emerge as one mechanism through which city, state, and federal government could, in effect, displace and disenfranchise these individuals and these communities. And so in one way, the all-Black towns, they didn't fail, they were just erased, they were removed, they were not allowed, the individuals were not allowed to actually occupy these spaces anymore by virtue of Jim Crow laws and so on. When we get to the 1950s and 60s, the kind of radical reinvention of infrastructure as a federal project began to very much impact directly these communities. And so this is an image of Rochester, New York, a portion of Rochester, New York, that was being cleared by virtue of eminent domain to make way for the interstate, or an extension of the interstate. And this family in particular was targeted at the end of 3 days of protests. And her son is known to have been hiding behind the balustrade of this front porch. And she, in effect, is trying to protect what's remaining of her house before it is destroyed and demolished. Similarly, if we look at Miami in part, we can look no further than places like Opa-locka, Florida, and the Overtown community that was summarily erased and destroyed and disenfranchised to make way for the Interstate 95. And so if you follow the pathway of Interstate 95 across and up the eastern seaboard, what you'll realize is that the devaluation of land and the devaluation of property and the devaluation by and large of Black and Brown communities led to the building of infrastructural systems such as highways and so forth, in order then to create these connectivities that only certain communities could have access to.
And so I think in that moment in which the sense that, Black communities were again, being removed through urban renewal, or as writer James Baldwin called it, Negro removal, there were people who had other visions, other ways of thinking, using the language of modernism. And one of those was June Jhordan, who was actually trained in environmental design at Barnard, who became a writer. And here she is in a collaboration with Buckminster Fuller with her Sky Rise to Harlem. The article is actually written under her nom de plume, But it was a project that imagined a way of keeping Black social life intact by literally, taking it from the ground and moving those relationships, those tight bonds of community together, sort of stitched into these towers as they rise up into the city with these new opportunities of housing. Next, please. And we know that continuation, the demolition and destruction of Black life, it persists both with urban renewal, but also with the catastrophic disasters of flooding and hurricanes, because those neighborhoods were often built at the bottoms on land that was not seen as desirable. And so with Katrina, we saw the ways in which Black populations were highly vulnerable because of the systemic and decades-long disenfranchisement in the built environment, as well as the project of high-rise housing in places like Chicago, which were often utter failures for a lack of maintenance, as well as investment in a large number of social services that would enable those communities to have thrived. Next, please.
And here we're just kind of contrasting two, say, visions of infrastructure. On your left is I-81, which was recently discussed, I believe, in The Guardian, about not only the fact that it is fundamentally dividing the city, but there are moves afoot currently to now demolish portions of I-81 to create mid-income housing. However, as architect Sekou Cook does and reveals in our exhibition, this idea of kind of resolving division through other kinds of divisions furthers, I think, many of the issues that we are still facing in this country around how do we reconcile an infrastructure that fundamentally begins to separate rather than to link or to connect communities. And to contrast this, to think about the infrastructure of people and communities and advocates and so forth. This image is from Mario Gooden's project in our exhibition, looking at civil rights marches of the 1960s, in which downtown Nashville became a site for the mobilization of communities to go against the divisive nature of infrastructural projects that had for so long been inaccessible to Black communities.
And so we know, this question of protest, advocacy is a long one. And of particular concern is the ways in which Black communities are often sites of environmental degradation, as this protest on the right in Warrenton, North Carolina, which again gets mirrored in we see this with Black Lives Matter protests, and in the ways in which they attempt to sort of stop PCB dumping in that nearby town. But also even today, this is still happening with the ways in which the water system in Flint, Michigan was deliberately poisoned by disinterested and dispassionate government officials that has caused a catastrophe, probably decades long and generations long within that city of Flint. Next, please. And it's important to also recognize that infrastructure, again, of mass incarceration and the ways in which that has impacted urban communities, clearly, but also the ways in which the prison industrial complex impacts communities. This is Sing Sing Prison, a photograph by Stephen Torrentis, who shows the impact of these kinds of architectures on the landscapes of the communities that are not only housed within them, but also dependent upon them. Next, please.
And I would just chime in here and say that one of the essays in our field guide talks about the relationship of prisons in particular and the poisoning of water systems and other infrastructural systems in the communities that by and large have to surround those prisons or have to be adjacent to prisons in order to maintain the prison complex as a continued form of division and disenfranchisement. And so I would say, too, to Mabel's point, the occupation of public space, in this case from last year, almost a year exactly, the occupation of public space then becomes one of the mechanisms through which we can not only visualize, but also try to understand that the centuries-long disenfranchisement and disinvestment in Black histories and in Black spaces come full circle when we look at the murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor, and so forth.
And, you know, one could say that, as Michelle Obama reminded us, the White House was built with enslaved laborers, but the entire city of Washington, D.C., in fact, this street was probably cleared with groups of enslaved workers. And so the nation was wholly dependent on its investment in the slave trade and enslaved peoples for the construction of its own wealth. Next, please.
So all of this is to say, that when Mabel and Ariel Dion-Krosnick, our curatorial assistant, and I began to work with an extraordinary advisory committee that we brought together to ask not only how to respond to these histories, but how do we begin to move beyond them in certain ways. We basically had to throw out all the conventions of exhibition making. We had to throw out all of the notions of architecture as being a space of division and boundary making in order to reach a kind of space, if you will, to allow then the 11 participants that the advisory committee and we chose to begin their own research, to begin their own thinking in 10 cities across America. And so rather than dwelling in that process, I show you then the works of Amanda Williams on your left, and indeed looking at Kinloch, Missouri, the first and largest Black incorporated town of Missouri at the turn of the century, 20th century. In the center is Felicia Davis's Black Flower, or it's a receiving antenna that monitors the space of the gallery, but also the bodies within it. And then on your right is a clip from David Hart's film focused on the Watts neighborhood in Los Angeles.
And so here we have Yolanda Daniels' Black City, the Los Angeles edition. And this is actually part of a larger project that Yolanda has been doing, sort of trying to figure out the sort of grammar of Black cities and Black space. And in particular, as a newcomer to Los Angeles, she wanted to really explore that history, particularly of Black settlement in the city, and really uncovering some really remarkable history of Biddy Mason, who owned a large tract in downtown Los Angeles, and the ways in which she built out a kind of enclave of Black homeowners, business people within downtown, but also noting how quickly that history gets buried and erased. And so that's the 19th century. And on the right, you see a 20th century version at long drawing along Central Avenue, again, sort of the layering of Black urban history. And in the middle is a model that really starts to materialize the layering of that history. Next, please.
And with the works of Olalekan Jefus, he's a Brooklyn-based but Nigerian-born artist, trained as an architect. It was essential to kind of not posit a dystopic future, but rather to posit a possible future in his work that focuses on the Crown Heights neighborhood in Brooklyn. And this is just the frontal view. There are more works on the back of this wall, But at the top is a video that he produced, kind of touring these spaces of Crown Heights in the future after massive flooding due to climate change has isolated these communities. And as a result, as a consequence, if you will, Black life and it begins to emerge on its own in a form or forms of self-sufficiency. And so the kiosk on the right side of this display is one such kind of intersection with the lack of mobility and the possibility for mobility. And the idea here in this work is that that someone could get a ticket and then be able to move through space. And what you're looking at then in the video and then in the renderings are views of such spaces in which, excuse me, in which street-side chapels become seed vaults, where roof gardens start to feed the entire community and our public spaces, and subway cars become classrooms for connectivity around the world, or VR classrooms, I should say, around the world.
And here we have Sekou Cook's work in Syracuse. We out here, and in the gallery actually is a porch, a stoop, a space of social life in the public housing in Syracuse that was an outcome essentially of the urban renewal project, which is now, as Sean mentioned earlier, demolished for mixed income housing. And so it's really a kind of archaeology of housing type, but also within that type surveying these kinds of fortuitous spaces, hidden spaces of Black social life within that landscape where Black sociality thrived and continues to hold promise. Next, please.
And similarly with Jermaine Barnes, which is adjacent to Sekou, Jermaine is looking at Miami, not necessarily as a city of neighborhoods, but what he describes, and the title of the work or the installation is called A Spectrum of Blackness, that the connectivities across Miami in part are because that Blackness within the city is not only defined as, say, African-American, but Caribbean, Panamanian, Bahamian, Dominican, and so forth. And with the work that you see on the right, the hanging work, he has reconstructed or deconstructed a spice cabinet and remade all of the labels of these individual spices to indicate the ways in which Blackness then feeds into, literally and figuratively, into the production of food, but then kind of reinscribes the ways in which, say, a kitchen is understood as a public and a private space. The kitchen as a space in which sociality is conferred and constructed. And in the back is a map that he reconstructs of what is a 1956 map of Miami called the Negro building areas. And he remarks quite astutely, I think, that much of those areas are now highly sought after, highly gentrified, because they are on higher ground.
Right. And this is a work by the architect Emmanuel Admasu of the firm Adwo. It's tapestry in the back is the blue, and what you see in the orange actually is a continental rift. It's very much an autobiographical narrative. Emmanuel was born in Addis and traveled to the United States, migrated to the United States as a teenager to Atlanta, Georgia. And so it was across that rift, crossing that line, is where he became Black. And so it sort of tells that story, right, of that middle passage. and the ways in which that produced the hold of the slave ship, produced that condition of Blackness. But the project is really about finding both these lines. He did also an astute study of Atlanta, Georgia, and understanding the kinds of racial divides that were literally constructed within the city. You know, there was an area, a neighborhood in particular, that built a wall in the 1950s to separate a Black and white neighborhood. But that the ways in which that line of segregation is also changing in relationship to the gentrification of the city. And from his own experience of growing up in Atlanta, there are always these spaces where, again, just like in the two previous projects, Black life thrived, social life thrived, especially for youth in places like the Waffle House, where you would go as a teenager after parties, or in college after parties. But also Atlanta is an incredibly green city. And so there's also this ways in which the landscape also offered these kind of hidden spaces, what Sylvia Winter would call the underground of Black social life. And so here's a sense of that, the model, which actually has magnets, which show this kind of moving of this Black sand, which is actually the kind of sand that one would find in the continental rift. Next, please.
And so the last project that we'll share today is that of Walter Hood in Oakland, California. And Walter's project begins to look at a 1 mile stretch of San Pablo Avenue. It is the street upon which his studio is located. And the ways in which this street over time has become one of the most condensed areas for community programs in the Bay Area. And instead of trying to make new spaces, for instance, for these community engagement partners and collaborations, he inverts the condition and says, actually, these spaces, these community spaces, could be made as towers. And those towers then begin to emblematize and to signify the space and the prominence of Black life in Oakland, if not throughout the entire Bay Area. And the design process that Walter chose then is to first look at the Black Panthers 10-point program. You see a few of those points at the top of the wall there above his drawings and prints. And then the Sanborn map that he has kind of reinscribed these towers. But then also he's linking these community spaces, these partners, to revenue, specifically to revenue, and how that revenue could then generate these towers in and of themselves. And intriguingly, the design for the towers then becomes in part an analysis of inventions of Black inventors at the turn of the 20th century and early 20th century that begins and then speaks to Amanda Williams in the other part of the gallery, but also that their formal invention, while based in that kind of invention, also begins to indicate their bodily qualities. And so when you are standing in the gallery, these towers are around 6.5 feet tall. They begin to, in a way, operate like bodies in space and become frameworks through not only looking at Walter's work on the wall, but also frameworks for looking into the other spaces of the gallery itself. So Mabel, I think that's it for Walter. Did you want to add anything more?
No, I mean, I think this gives a sense of the larger project, the ways in which the 11 artists, architects, and designers sort of responded to both the context in which we were working, both this question of the ways in which anti-Black racism manifested in the built environment, but also a sense of like Black space and what that means and how that is crafted at multiple scales.
All right, I'll stop sharing again.
Great, thank you, Sean. Thank you, Mabel. So in just a minute, I'm gonna welcome our response one by one, and reminder just to stick around for the conversation. We're gonna do our best to emulate a roundtable here, but I wanted to start with one question for myself, which is just, could you speak a little bit about how you shaped the commissions? Why focus on these 10 cities? And how did you sort of encourage the artists to communicate to MoMA's broad general audience?
Sure, I'll start. As I mentioned earlier, early on in our presentation, for us, it was incredibly important to, in a way, throw away a lot of what it meant to, say, commission work or commission new work. And that is in part because the modernist legacy of commissioning architects and designers to, say, solve problems, we wanted to move away from that idea that, in fact, solving problems often creates more problems rather than actually resolving or even attempting to resolve them. And so it was very much on the advisory committee's part and ours that the way we could do this was to instead kind of rechart the language that we used in order to create the, say, platform for the individual commissions. And this was, I should have included this image, but we called it a matrix in which we divided the matrix into scales and spaces and, context scales and spaces. But the scales were of, say, a sidewalk, a kitchen table, what else, Mabel? And then the spaces were of, thank you. She's always at the ready here. You can see then here, the scales, the spaces, and then the sites. This is what we then gave to the participants. And they then could choose not only the city that they wanted to investigate, but also the ways in which they could chart this language, these conditions, these histories, and importantly, I think, the narratives. And by doing so, we're not solving, right? We're not solving problems, but we're actually trying to inscribe new meaning to the continual disenfranchisement of Black communities in the country.
And this is just an image of the advisory committee, right? And so you see, we were in the founders, it's very interesting space in MoMA, the founders room, and there's Sekou Cook on the left and Manuel Atmasu, and all the Black around the table is Amanda in her incredible yellow. To the right is Diane Harris, who contributed to the catalog, great work, and also Christina Sharp as well. So it was really a remarkable group. And I think part of the sense was, is it the responsibility of African Americans to solve the problem of white oppression, right? And I feel like that's often, you know, what Black architects are asked to do, that we don't get that capacity, that opportunity to dream, to imagine, to think. We just have to solve. And I think there was a sense that no, actually the imagination's quite fertile. You have to imagine liberation before you can achieve it. And that was a really important charge that we wanted to have as part of the exhibition.
Wonderful, thank you for that. It's great to get that inside look. So I'm gonna actually welcome on our first respondent, April D. Simone, who's the founder of Designing the We, where she mounted the Undesign the Red Line exhibition. And she's now the founder and principal of a new organization, Spatial Forensics. Welcome, April.
Thank you, Dan, and congratulations on many fronts with the launch of this exhibition. Grateful to each of you and UDF for convening this conversation. Of course, like many, I too was captivated in very numerous ways, not only around the exhibit content, but just even the dialogue surrounding the exhibition. I was particularly struck by your comments, Sean, about searching in the archives and this erasure that existed of Blackness within those archives and the playing out of the continued collateral consequences of that erasure, particularly in the fields of architecture, and the deeper systems at play that have led to such erasure. And the intentionality of both you and Mabel to do something about this around Reconstruction. I was struck around the interrogation of these histories, as was noted in the presentation, of what space was like and how you navigated space with your identity freely, and not this narrative that often surrounds what we sort of attribute to spatial dynamics of dehumanization that, again, sort of stifle this imagination of futures. So with all of that energy, one thing I pondered on with the exhibition, and again, this dialogue, was, within this context of framing, in what ways has MoMA embraced the response and framework of this exhibition to what I believe, I'm paraphrasing, Amanda Williams says, to keep on keeping on, right? Like, to how does the momentum continue, particularly in this moment of spatial interrogation of systems of supremacy. And, and how, in using this framework as part of continuing this momentum, do we, or is the thought there to use it as a grounding for a deeper dialogue in their own backyard, in MoMA's own backyard, right? Particularly as we are seeing that members of the African diaspora are raising a concern through the Strike MoMA movement around the perpetuation of systems that are behind this erasure that you referenced, and that they are feeling, this is threatening Black futures within the built environment. How has this subscribed to this opportunity?
Yeah, no, amazing questions. Thank you. And also, thank you. Can you put a link to the show that you worked on? Because it was at the Boston Architectural Center, correct?
Yes.
Amazing, amazing, amazing. I love that show. Thank you so much for that. Really great work. I shared it with students and friends, and awesome. But really important work to show these mechanisms, right? In the catalog, in our field guide, the front page is an HLC map, but the back page is a drawing that my practice produced, showing that COVID mapped exactly onto those areas, right, of grade D. That is systemic, and it's not only spatial, it's temporal, right, and the ways in which it continues, and that's important. And I do think you have to be in it for the long haul. It's not instant, and you just have to keep pushing and pushing and pushing, both from outside of institutions and also within institutions. And sometimes it's important to create your own institutions,
That's right.
Create your own collaborations, as emerged out of the show, the Black Reconstruction Collective.
Absolutely. I would say, from the MoMA perspective, if I may, I'm sitting here in the institution, that, maybe I ascribe a little bit to Walter Di Mignolo, who says that, institutions will never change. Mm-hmm. And that the ways in which we create change is actually from all the external constellations of exhibition making, like your own, amazing, and writing and thinking with and among communities, to affect some kind of mechanism through which change can happen. I'm optimistic on certain days. I am very cynical on a lot of days. I think it's important to note that we made this exhibition in the midst of a pandemic. We never saw a single work in physical form until it arrived in our galleries. Mm-hmm. If we can do that, then I think the world is possible, right? But at the same time, it does require and demand that architecture, urban design, all of these related professions begins to reconcile with these histories, these narratives, and not just, paying lip service to them, but actually doing the thinking and the work necessary to create transformation. And to that end, and I have to say this, after more than 90 years, the museum had not collected the work of a single African-American architect. in the institution that created the first Department of Architecture and Design. What that suggests to me, and I think I echo Mabel in this context, is that it's going to take a long time.
Yeah, I mean, it took the African American Museum, what, 100 years? And that was a project. I mean, that was a long-term project to do it. But as you could see, it landed up in the Smithsonian, which had not collected anything Black, period, really until the 50s, 60s, until there was pressure to do so. And even then, the brilliance of that institution, and most people don't realize it, they didn't just build that building. They had to build a parallel collection because there was nothing there. And so it's not just MoMA, it's a kind of larger project to excise, right? Because people of African descent do not have history. That's what Hegel said, right? We are outside, we only live in the moment, right? So it's so epistemically embedded, right? Literally in the way of being, the ontology of being modern. And we have to question that. And we have to understand that it isn't just one thing. It's a range of things that we have to push back against. But the work's exhausting because to do this kind of work, you almost have to build your own apparatus within these institutions, precisely because exhibitions are always archival, right? And when you don't have anything in the archive, you have to construct a way of producing that knowledge. And that's what our advisory committee did.
It's awesome. I appreciate it. I can gobble up all the time speaking to you both, but I want to share.
Well, actually, I'm going to ask all
question.
Three of you a question, which is, now that you guys have mounted these exhibitions, what advice do you have for the future writers and curators and editors that want to comment on the deep and difficult relationship between race and the urban environment?
There needs to be much more. And there needs to be, I strongly believe that there aren't enough people actually writing about and thinking about these things, because I think Mabel would agree, and April would agree, that because of the ways in which pedagogy has worked, especially in these realms, there aren't people who can access or think about or even respond to these histories. So as to Mabel's point, it's you have to create the ways in, literally create the ways in which individuals then can build knowledge and imagine what happens after.
Yeah, and make no mistake, the built environment's about power, period, right? Those HO maps were only produced because it was about power and about money and wealth, right? And I think that's why architecture and urbanism has been the last stand, because it perpetuates white power spatially. And that's quite, I mean, that's just, that's what it is. And so to push back on that and to imagine and to create other ways of building, other forms of producing, right, community ideas of ownership, I think it's going to take time to understand what that would mean and how that would operate. And I think there are potentially models out there, but that, that's what also needs to circulate.
Great, April, any last thoughts before we shift to the next?
No, I'm just looking forward to how do we engage and continue cultivating these spaces, because I think there's just a zeal and a hunger within this younger generation. Absolutely. In particular, that they're looking for spaces that they don't want to go into these draconian environments of architecture, and that the boundaries are reinforced. And people like Leslie Loco are very inspirational, because they're trying to disrupt the pedagogy of these spaces, and there's tremendous resistance to that. But we have to create more to counter this narrative that's so dominant, as you said, Mabel, through power, and saying that there are these futures that can look like this, that we begin to deconstruct this enormous violence and dehumanization again that has taken place.
Absolutely.
Great. So I'm going to welcome on Addison Vawters, who's a neighborhood planner with the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development and a member of the Pinko Collective. Addison.
Hello.
Hello. Thanks.
We have you in voice, but not on camera. There we go.
Oh, can you hear me?
I can see you.
And, yeah. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with each of you. So I've been wondering if you've noticed or even particularly interested in, or perhaps even encouraged in the construction of the show, an increased focus on concepts of repair and care in terms like reparative architecture or architecture as self-care. Because I've been sort of wary of the growing prevalence of these concepts, because I think sort of Black liberation usually has advanced through sort of violent material socialist militancy and upheaval. So please challenge me if there's not a contradiction between care and militancy, but I'm wondering how this curatorial project addressed this or thought about it, and what the show says about either of those different ethoses and their importance for material transformation in these communities.
I mean, I'll take care. Do you want to take repair, Sean?
Sure.
You start.
Amazing. It's a superb set of thoughts, because I will admit that the first time that we proposed this exhibition to the powers that be here, it was entitled Repair. But it was repair on an idea that we were not fixing anything, because repair, in our view, induces different kinds of precarities. So that when you repair, it actually, whatever we might be thinking about at any scale, that repair creates conditions for more breakage. And it was extraordinary Adrienne Brown, scholar at University of Chicago, who in one of our convenings then said, this show should not be called Repair, but Reconstruction. And it was that dual notion of Reconstruction as a historical period and moment, and the failure of it, but also that repair as a broad social project can be embedded in the mechanisms by which we begin to address and think about and understand the spaces of care. And I leave that then to Mabel to respond to.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think all of the projects actually are about this question of care, right? Because I think that sense of mutual aid, that both the emphasis, because I always say that you can't think about race in this country, or anti-Black racism in particular, without understanding patriarchy, right? That the impulse to violence, right, is kind of an outcome of both the legacy of liberalism, but also the ways in which power manifests and violence is necessary to take and keep. And so much of care, if we look at care labor today, it's feminized, it's racialized, right? And so it's not valued. What's valued is ingenuity and genius and Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, but what's not recognized, right, are, the people who are doing childcare, literally the care for patients, right, under COVID, like that labor and the social bonds that emerge out of care practices, I think, are vital. And so that's, with Felicia Davis's project, for example, she was looking at mutual aid in the face of urban renewal and what that meant, and how literally relationships were stitching themselves together, right, as a kind of social fabric. And so I think that's a really, really, really important aspect. Now, whether the monetization of self-care, right, which I think is what you're referencing, and what that means, I don't know, but I know the term self-care comes out of Audre Lorde, right, and the ways in which Black women have to care for themselves, precisely because the mechanisms of society, of family, do not provide them the space to basically, rejuvenate and to repair the mental and physical stresses.
Great. Any thoughts, Addison, for me?
No,
All right.
no. We can move
Cool. Thanks,
Yeah.
Addison.
No, great question. I mean, I taught a studio on care last semester, protocols of care. And so it was really interesting to explore that question with students at an architectural level. So I think that's it's something to ponder. So thank you.
Great. I'm going to welcome on Emma Silverblatt. Emma is an associate with Solid Objectives, also known as So Ill. Welcome, Emma.
Hi, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us and present today. This has been, I mean, I was really inspired by the show. And as an architect, one of my favorite moments was Sekou Cook's physical model, where he forgoes the podium, places the model on a section concrete stoop. So this choice, at first, it subverts the pristine nature of the architecture model, but it also speaks by engaging a cultural object at full scale that, though it seems universal semiotically, bears particular weight in the way it's been criminalized in Black communities. And to me, that move reveals the double-edged object at the built environment scale, but also pulls in the pedagogic scale. It points to invisible forces of white perspective in positions of power behind architectural production techniques and full-scale use. So the question that raised to me, can architectural tools derived in this Eurocentric, elitist, misogynist system, can they be used for creating an architecture of Blackness, or are they in themselves a barrier to entry? And do you have a vision for redefining the practice's traditional modes of operation, its current institutions, and this pedagogy that could move towards an alternate design process rooted in equity in the built environment?
Yeah, no, great question and fantastic insight on Sekou's stoop, which was interesting to see it installed, right? To go from literally Sekou's backyard into the gallery, right? And it is, I mean, you see the moss, you see the use, right? I mean, it is this kind of like everyday object that really, I think, disrupts the pristine white wall, right, space of the gallery. I think, you know, it's the Audre Lorde question, will the master's tool dismantle the master's house? And I think that's going to be that's a complicated question, like whether or not that's possible. And again, I'm wondering, are there other ways? And, you know, April mentioned Leslie Loco, who's starting this new institute, right, of architectural education, the AFI. And I think it's a question of like, how do we think teaching people about the built environment and to build within the built environment, and what would that mean? Like, what would it mean to sort of maybe abandon our Beaux-Arts and then Bauhausian and environmental design education, and maybe teach about the built, and I use the term built environment because I think architecture also has its roots in colonialism in Europe at a moment when that was happening. And the people have built, they build without architects, they have built huge constructions without architecture in the protocols in which the West has defined it. And its historiography has universalized that term to rope in all those projects and to basically periodize them, to basically validate modernity and modernism in particular. And so I would just wonder, what would a pedagogical approach look like? How would we teach that? And that would just question the siloing of disciplinarity. And this isn't just happening in architecture. This, I think, is happening. I'm having conversations with students in English and, you know, other disciplines, education, to think about what would a university, right, which promulgated the universal, right, the West's universal ideals, what would that look like to teach building differently?
And I would say to that is, again, with the interdisciplinarity, so much of what I've learned about architecture is not from architects or from architectural histories, but actually thinking through and thinking with people like Adrienne Brown, who's an English scholar and was looking at literature and looking at the ways in which, or trying to understand the ways in which Black space and Black futurity is already inscribed in the in the built environment. And that when we try to disentangle or to dismiss even that these spaces, we are not only dismissing incredibly entangled sets of cultural and social values, but we are also dismissing meaning in the built environment and architecture in whatever capacity we want to write architecture right now. So it's something to think about from a pedagogical. I think a pedagogical space is to say from the very beginning, an architecture student, for instance, what does it mean to have human rights? What does it mean that laws are spatial? What does it mean that economics and politics are built in as much as defined through the ways in which architecture or buildings and landscapes are effectively made? So on one hand, you can't necessarily do away with that history, but at the same time, why not, right? Why not get rid of, but why not just for a moment consider that the African continent is an incredible resource of design thinking that for so long has not been a part of architectural curricula. Why not? And what would that mean then for a student or sets of students to be able to see themselves in the pedagogy, in the ways in which that architecture, landscape architecture, is being taught today? So I believe that we can move past the white pedestal, and we should. And the ways in which we do that then becomes a kind of active, not a sense of resistance, but an acceptance that this is how we build anew for the future.
Yeah, we also have in the book the poet Tanya Foster, who writes a beautiful meditation on New Orleans, actually. And I think, you know, she's definitely a poet who writes about space and place. And I think it's in poetry, it's in literature. You know, June Jhordan ended up becoming a writer. Noah Purefoy, you know, who could have been a kick-ass case study house architect, right? But he couldn't work. Joel Robinson, right, who is in the MoMA, you know, was the one thing in the MoMA study collection that we could find by a Black person. You know, he just, I can't find work in the lily white field of architecture in the 1950s, right? So he did, he did fabric design and product design, and, you know, and so I think there are all of these other ways in which Black space is being imagined, you know, Emiri Baraka's Kawaida Tower. I mean, there's so many models, or the Black Panthers 10 points that Walter Hood references. All of that is really, you know, there were models of urban policy in that that actually do continue, even though the Black Panthers were vilified by the police and dismantled. And so, you know, I think there's an archive out there. It's just not, you're not going to find it in institutions like MoMA.
Great, thanks for that question, Emma. I'm going to pull in Sheila Lin, who's a designer and part of the project team with Adjei Associates. Welcome, Sheila.
Oh, thanks, Sheila.
Hello, thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Mabel and Sean, for this incredible exhibition. I think I just want to say first that, you know, generally the work that you both have been doing in your respective institutions in New York and outside of it has made a phenomenal difference on, you know, a lot of people like myself and others who have entered the space. And so it's so exciting to be in conversation with you. I've been thinking sort of about how the show has created a new and necessary discourse around the role of a museum and institution at large, and also reinterpreting and not only representing urban history that has largely been underwritten. One of the things I've been thinking about as well is how the show kind of allows for a creation of community rather than audience, and I'm interested to know your thoughts on how, you know, beyond the representation of people who typically haven't been in the MoMA, how you guys sort of came about bringing in the right stakeholders and advisors to create this process of really expanding the audience of a museum. I think to Addison's earlier point, I'm interested in this title of Reconstruction and how it alludes to both you know, the late 1800s period, but also reconstruction of the future, right? And I think the notion of repair doesn't really resonate with me because I often find that, there's a lot of Black history cannot be repaired. It's been destroyed, erased, and it's a matter of kind of reconstructing. I think about this often when people talk about seeking justice for what can no longer be sought justice for, but rather kind of reframed institutionally. And these aren't really questions; these are just thoughts. Just getting them out, and I hope we can discuss later on. I love that the exhibition speaks to this unique temporality of Blackness and what might sometimes be called imaginary or Afrofuturistic, though I understand that term is pretty loaded. The exhibition does ask you to confront the speculative future that is often alluding to the past, right? So what is being seen as future is actually recreation of what is in the past. So I'm curious to know how you as curators and the artists and architects involved thought about the chronology of the exhibition, if that was if it was understood from that framework at all. And lastly, one of the ideas we've been exploring throughout the fellowship is what a self-sufficient neighborhood embodies. And I don't know if you all have seen in the New York Times yesterday, there was this a 3D model of Tulsa on the 100th anniversary of the massacre. And I've been thinking about self-sufficiency as one of the kind of main ways we can move forward from the white pedestal. And Tulsa and these neighborhoods were often referred to as, Black Wall Street, whatever. But when I think about how, every dollar spent in Greenwood was said to have circulated 30 times before it left the community, I don't know where or how that exists in the world today, but I'm curious to hear more of what you guys think about holistic models of design and planning and development that could potentially keep wealth within the communities. I think that's it for now, but looking forward.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, I mean,
Mabel, you first.
No, that's a
I just
really
kept going, and
no. I think that's a really great
it's
question.
good.
I think the question is like, what percentage of every dollar now goes to Jeff Bezos? He owns so much, and it's terrifying, right? Because at least he's remained relatively stable. But if Jeff, he's already kind of on the, but if he just goes, we are up in tough, Schitt's Creek, and not the TV show. But I think that's actually true today. I remember seeing a few years ago that local businesses actually do circulate money more locally than do what we're seeing now, particularly in this country, transnational companies setting up businesses locally, right? And that's true because that money just goes back out and up into, right, dividends. And that's a problem, I think, because it robs, it keeps wages low. Locally, you're a service worker, you're non-unionized, and so there's almost impossible to have leverage, right? Which is exactly what the fight at Amazon's about. But I do think collective organizing is so critical for that. That's why unions formed, because they knew they had to scale up in order to challenge corporate power back in the 19th century. And I think that still holds true today, except oftentimes both the spatial global reach of corporations are so big, and yet the power is so concentrated. So it is a kind of maybe slightly different paradigm about that. But I do think, I think it is important to find, certainly I'm finding in a lot of the work that I do, collective action to work collaboratively and collectively on different kinds of projects. And I think that was true certainly at MoMA. Our advisory group was so essential to understanding, that project. And I think that point of reconstructions, I was looking at a quote from Du Bois, who said reconstructions, let me find the exact quote because I'm going to mangle it. He says that to reconstruct, that it was actually the freeing of Black folk was to reconstruct the basis of American democracy from 1860 to 1880. I mean, it was a project to see Does America actually promise what it said it did, both in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution? That immediately was shut down, right? By 1880, there was a promise in the civil rights movement, right? I'm a civil rights baby. We had a 50-year arc of that. And, we see that promise didn't happen. And so, do we do another 50 years, or do we change the terms, right, through which we engage as a nation, right, and as humans? And I think that's actually where, for me, the most promise is. But I don't think it's going to be one thing. I think it's got to be a much larger movement in order to do that, of which I think architects will play, a role, or understanding the built environment will play a role.
And I'll just add a little bit, because there's a lot of discussion right now about intergenerational wealth, and the fact that many Black families and Black individuals couldn't, because they didn't have wealth to begin with, or were not allowed to even have wealth in many ways, that this translation over time then demands new ways in which wealth is conceived and is translated or transferred among individuals and communities. And if I were to scale that in a different way to the built environment and to communities, is to think about the ways in which communities create value for themselves, right? Rather than having the imposition of external agents define or devalue the ways in which they operate. And that can happen also with the definition of making buildings or landscapes, right? That who's to say that an architect is the only person that can create space or create spaces and build them. And I think our exhibition at least points to the possibility that that is not anymore, or shouldn't be anymore, the only MO for building, right? That making and building communities must be from the ground up, if not below the ground up, I should say.
Yeah, no, I think one project that does question that issue of value is Immeasurability by Emmanuel Admasou. And he says immeasurability precisely against the measurability of everything, where everything literally is quantified so it can be abstracted, into representations, including the monetary, right? So that's why he's saying that Blackness formed. When you're in Africa, let's say 400 years, you are who you are, you believe the way you do, but as soon as you are captured and marked Black, Negro, right, you then become abstracted literally into something that is fungible for money. You can be exchanged, you are an investment. And that's problematic, right? Because then Blackness becomes, and during slavery, on one hand, a term of valuation, but also on the other hand, a term of devaluation of life, because you're no longer life, you are human, you are property, right? And that's why we still see today, I don't know if you've been following in the news, when a Black person goes to have their house appraised, right? They have to take down everything that represents Blackness, because if they don't, the house will be valued less. And these people are figuring it out. Let me get my white friend Ted to come over and sit in my house so that my house will actually have more value. Like, what is that? It's the same house. But that is the definition of insanity. It's madness, right? But the modern world and the Alignment Project was supposed to be about reason, right? So it makes no sense. That's why I think we have to have new epistemes and ways of being human together to get out of this trap of measurability and value, because otherwise we're not going to survive as a human species. It's literally killing the air, the land, right? That we as a species survive, and the whole other species as well.
Great, thanks for that, Sheila. I'm going to invite on Jhordan Channer, an architectural designer with WXY Architecture. Jhordan. Welcome.
Hey guys, I really appreciate this exhibition. Really like expanded my, ideas of how, practice operates. What is happening?
We can hear
Can
you.
you guys hear me?
Yep. You're a little broken up, but we can still hear you.
Oh, you froze.
Oh, everything's frozen, but I'll just say words. I've been thinking a lot about someone.
Try turning off your video.
I've been thinking a lot about last summer's uprisings and this concept of Hey, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
So, I
Yes.
just turned off.
Yes.
Okay. I've been thinking a lot about some concept of defunding the police, abolishing police, and how we like really analyze like the role of police in society. You find that they don't actually solve crimes, you press, people who pay their salaries, kind of thing. And I've like taken this lens, put it to like my own and to deconstructing it and wondering, architecture aspect, is it valuable? There's also propaganda, which is, propaganda around the value of police and what they do. And I feel similarly same in architecture. And I think they both operate together in many ways. Kind of tail and how that sort of related to development and urbanism. So I guess my question is architecture overvalued? Actually, do we defund architecture and architects? And I guess the other question is like, in relation to this exhibition, why are architects education through architecture uniquely positioned to imagine for spaces? In the same way, I wonder where culture, operate in our communities, that kind of thing.
So Jhordan, just so you know, we missed a little bit of the question, but I think there was something that Sean and Mabel can take out.
Well, I would say, I would go back to what Mabel was saying about architecture and power, right? And that the inscription of power in the built environment, in spaces large and small, creates the ways in which we understand not only ourselves, right, but also value systems. And so when those value systems then are translated into not only human life, but also the spaces in which human life can take place, and then are extended or not by virtue of the police presence, then you have a doubling or a redoubling of that power that keeps people in place, literally in place. And so I think my understanding, my kind of limited understanding of defund the police is not to say we get rid of them altogether, but maybe we rethink the ways in which systems of policing and systems of creating and engendering power in our communities and in urban spaces gets challenged. Otherwise, it will just continue happening, and it will just continue to be that these spaces, communal, urban, neighborhoods, and so forth, are always going to be marked, as Mabel said, always going to be marked as other, always going to be marked as dangerous. And then when we take away that possibility of otherness in this capacity, we have the potential to think of liberation on both spatial terms, but also human terms?
Yeah, I mean, Laura Kurgan, my colleague at Columbia, did a really great project, $1 Million Blocks, with Eric Cardona, I think, who's a sociologist at Rutgers, right? That showed the amount of money that actually goes into keeping someone incarcerated, right? So mass incarceration actually it's profitable to do that. And what if that money instead went into social services within the blocks in which people were coming from? And that's really what that project shows. That project actually is in MoMA's collection. And so I think it's a really useful way of thinking about it. But, the problem of property, which seems so nonsensical, it seems so commonsensical rather to us, that I can actually own something, isn't necessarily the case for other peoples around the world. And the idea that you could own something was a radical thought in the West. But the important thing is that you could also own yourself, right? Self-possession is what leads to liberalism, essentially. I have property in myself, said John Locke, right? And so that idea of having to constantly protect property is also what led to policing, which in fact was to protect and maintain the property invested in enslaved people so they didn't run off, right? So that violence of policing in America is very much associated with the maintenance of property, right? And clearly, as we see today in architecture, in the investment, right, with the building of wealth in these huge towers. I mean, look at this city. I mean, we have towers, I call them space deposit boxes, where people are just parking cash, not even living there in these pencil towers. And I think it's a problem, particularly in a city where homelessness is at an all-time high and we are at a crisis. We have a $250 million vessel to nowhere and a $450 million exclusive park, right? That's $750 million spent on entertainment that could have gone to help solve the homeless problem in this country. It's a question of what, in a system of property, what are we going to invest in? So, I think we have to think about that, and dismantling, I think, the police and putting that money into public safety, but also other things that might lower what I call alternative economies that are dubbed criminal precisely because you can't work in other economies. Then yeah, it's a good investment, which is also to not say that criminal activity is not happening in the boardrooms of Wall Street. As we know, it is. It's just not being prosecuted.
Great, thanks for that question.
Cranky today, but I am.
Great, we're running low on time. I do want to kind of welcome a question from the audience. So I'm going to invite Mike Harrington to join over audio, at least. Mike, I don't know if you can.
Oh, can you all hear me?
We can.
Oh, and yeah, great to see you, April. I know it's been a long time. So yeah, I just have a quick question from something that you mentioned earlier. I'm a huge fan of Dawood Bey. I'm also a photography student, and I was reading his book about community, where he talks about the importance of making art that, like, when you make art or something that represents people, that it is important to make that available to them. He felt that was something that was that people should be able to see the representations that come from their community. So I wanted to know if there's any plans to share any parts of the exhibits with the other cities, since there's 10 cities, or are you all planning on doing investigations in other cities and having exhibitions there? Thank you.
Well, I think we're entering a slightly tricky territory for me. I mean, I think one of our ambitions from the beginning, when Mabel and I first sat down with each other and were talking, would be to ask ourselves, what is the afterlife of an exhibition like this? This is even before we had assembled the advisory committee and so forth. Like, what are the afterlives of an exhibition? And generally, works from exhibitions get acquired. They might get shown again in the museum at some point down the road. And oftentimes they get packed up and sent back to the people that produce them. And our ambitions from the beginning were that how could we translate these ideas, these projects, these questions to to say HBCU schools of architecture, for instance, those who wouldn't have access or easy access to MoMA? How could we say take one project from one city and place it in another city and ask for some kind of relationship to develop? And I think we're at a stage now, because of our show closing, sadly, right as the city is reopening, that we are having to ask ourselves yet again, like, can what we have imagined continue in different ways? And so that's a very diplomatic way of saying we don't know. But also I would love, and I talk to Mabel all the time about this, I would love to make a project around the making of an exhibition like this and what it has entailed, and because it has not been easy at all, and what does it mean right now, but also over the course of the 3.5 years that we have been preparing this exhibition. And I think that it's going to take a lot more than, say, acquiring, hopefully, some of the works of the exhibition. I think it's going to take a lot more conversation with the BRC, and really try to also now rethink the ways in which our exhibition can become something more than itself. And so the start of that, just to conclude, the start of that was our online course through Coursera. It's free, called Reimagining Blackness in Architecture. And it was created in part with us and our amazing education team here. And that was just one platform, one little way in which we thought that we could begin to ask these questions past the end date, say, of the exhibition.
I mean, I will just add to what Sean said, because I think it gives a good perspective, is that in a curatorial process, for example, we insisted on a Black graphic designer to do the work, because remember, graphic designers are not in the archive, and we also wanted to support Black design. We also, we had lunches, we had dinners with our advisories, with the participants. We picked Black businesses. So again, to make sure that MoMA's money is actually going into Black businesses and Black communities. And so that was also part and parcel of, right? And so it's not just one thing, it's like you have to really think across the board in terms of how you work and how you curate something like this kind of project.
Great, thanks, Mike, for that. And I'm just gonna, I know we're at time, so I'm gonna close this out. I wish we could actually spend a lot longer. And it's nice to see a lot of the questions and the comments in the chat. It's amazing what even this unfortunately short exhibition has made possible. So congratulations to you both. And for everyone else who hasn't yet seen it, it's up until Monday, right? So there's still time. Check out the online course and the materials. And I just want to thank again, Sean, Mabel, April, Addison, Sheila, Jhordan, Emma, and Mike, all for joining us today. And thank you again so much for all that you guys do for the city too.
Thank you all. Thank you all.
Thank you. It's really great questions.
All right, everyone, take care. We'll see you soon. The forum's got plenty coming up with a whole new series on the future of the streets and future of food equity in the built environment. So please do stay tuned for all that. But I hope this is one of our last Zooms. So we'll hope to see you guys again outdoors in the short term. So thanks everybody, and
happy summer.
Happy summer.
Yeah.
Stay safe.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.